Welcome to WWDMD, a podcast that is all about peeling back the curtain on what clinicians really think and feel as they work with others. My guests, clinicians, who are also sometimes clients themselves, risk their vulnerability as they publicly share their emotional reactions to their clients, disclose their challenges in doing the work, and reveal their personal backgrounds. I'm Dr. Meyers. I'm a psychotherapist in New York City with 30 years of practice experience, specializing in anxiety and depressive disorders, as well as sibling relationships and family systems. I'm also a professor of social work at Malloy University on Long Island. I see this as a journey of self-reflection for not only our guests, but you, because with each episode, I'm hopeful that you will learn something new about yourself. Please note that any discussion of case details have been modified to protect the privacy of our clients.
What would Dr. Meyers do?
Hey everyone, today I'm with Kate Lund, a licensed clinical psychologist, resilience expert, author, and nationally recognized speaker whose work focuses on helping children, parents, and families build strength-based strategies to navigate adversity. She's the host of Optimized Mind podcast and the author of Bounce, Help Your Child Build Resilience and Thrive in School, Sports, and Life, and Step Away, The Keys to Resilient Parenting. And she has another book that just came out in October called Step Away, The Keys to Resilient Parenting. So, in a world where parenting feels increasingly complex, from managing social pressures and mental health concerns to balancing structure and independence, her work emphasizes that resilience isn't about avoiding challenges, it's about developing the internal and relational resources to move through them. So, we're going to talk today about parenting challenges and approaches in the context of resilience. I'm hoping that we can get to how parents can foster resilience in their children across different developmental stages. It's so interesting. And how to respond when challenges arise. And what we all could use, how to support self-esteem and confidence and emotionally healthy human beings. So welcome, Kate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, I have so many thoughts, as I often do, when I meet such interesting people. And I noticed, you do have this TEDx talk that's wonderful. And I want to get to all your thoughts about resilience and what it means to you. And I know you've had your own experiences, but I want to start off with something that really I thought was simple yet very deeply meaningful in what you had to say. And you spoke about the idea that it's so important that we frame in our lives what we can do rather than what we can't do. And you seem to have an ability to see what you or other people do have rather than we don't have, something that I think many, many of us struggle with. And as a social work professor, it makes me think about teaching the strengths perspective, right? We're so used to pathologizing, not only as helping professionals, but I think just lay people. We are so used to seeing what we don't have. So tell me a little bit about that idea, if it makes sense to start here, or if you need to contextualize this in a larger thought, broader thought.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's such a great question, and it's such an important point, and it's really at the core of the lens that I look through, focusing on what we can do as opposed to what we can't do is really so important and so powerful. And it's the thing that helps us to thrive within our own unique context, helps us to move towards our potential. And the reason this idea really is so central in my life is from when I was growing up with a medical condition called hydrocephalus, when the cerebral spinal fluid isn't circulating as it should, causing pressure to build up in the brain. Good news is hydrocephalus can be managed with something called a shunt. Bad news is that requires surgery, and shunts break often in childhood. They break whenever you have them, they can. Anyway, spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital, back to school, looking different, feeling different, lots of things I couldn't do. And what my parents helped me do, what my teachers helped me do, parents of friends, we weren't ignoring the challenges, but they really did, within that context, help me to focus more on what I could do. So I couldn't play contact sports. I couldn't play ice hockey like I really wanted to, like my brother did. But what could I do? And so slowly over time, I was introduced to tennis, for example. And that became a really core aspect of my identity and really helped me to connect with my peers. I became pretty good at it, actually. I was never the best, but that was okay too. I rarely won the tournaments, but that was okay too. I was playing because I really loved it, and I was able to build on that. And then there were other things, right? That they helped me to really focus on. All right, well, so you can't do this, but what can you do? And not in a way that we were ignoring the challenges, because those were very real and very hard, but the other side of that coin, the other side of that focus was extremely powerful for me.
I think what's so interesting is I don't know if you consider yourself lucky, but as I opened with the idea that we're so used to pathologizing, you had these experiences with teachers and your parents, and we're not even talking about mental health professionals. And how did they know that that's what they should be focusing on, or that it came naturally to them to even push you in that direction?
Well, it's such an interesting point. And, sure, there were moments when I think teachers struggled with that. They hadn't experienced this kind of thing before. This kid in their class had this weird medical thing. To them it was weird. It was strange. It was unusual, right? And so I just think that my parents, for whatever reason, knew. I don't know. I think they just intuitively picked up on what I needed to get through these hard moments, and maybe even what they needed to get through these hard moments, right? Because none of this in the mid 70s was really well known. It took a while to figure out what was going on. Imaging technology was not what it is today, so they couldn't really figure it out, and there were a lot of question marks. And I think perhaps maybe it was just my parents needed to see me as capable, didn't want to define me by the condition I happened to have. And that message really was internalized for me over time. And, not saying it was easy, but really, really powerful and important, and really has formed the way that I look at my work, never wanting folks to ignore the challenges that they have, but how can we figure out what your strengths are, what you do have, how you can move towards your potential within your context, despite what that context looks like?
So powerful, so interesting, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about when did you discover that that was a gift that was given to you that you feel, you need to lend to other caregivers and folks in general? Like, were
Well,
you aware of that as a child, that you were being recognized for who you were and rather than have a limitation, focus, you were really able to be resilient based on the support that you were given?
yeah, I don't think that I consciously was aware of that as a child, sort of developmentally, but
Right.
I do know that I was really interested in people, in understanding people,
Hmm.
from a younger age when it's not maybe that common to want to understand why did my friends act that way or say those things or what have you. So I always had that appreciation, that want to know about people. And that kind of morphed into, different volunteer opportunities and that sort of thing. And by the time I got to college, some work in hospitals and pediatric units and such. And I think it was at that point that I started to really figure out, like, oh, hmm. So yeah, I had these challenges, and the challenges are real, but I was able to move forward, and there was a reason for that. And I think that's where it started to come together. And then in graduate school, I was working on my doctorate and did a 2-year fellowship at Shriners Hospital for Children, working with kids who were catastrophically injured, burn injuries. And I think it really crystallized in those years, in terms of, okay, this child is never going to be the same, but yet, how can we help them create a new sense of normal and move forward from there using their strengths as a foundation?
Hmm.
And so I think it crystallized there and just has built over time, with my own kids and helping my own boys kind of figure out who they are
Yeah.
identify their strengths, move
Yeah.
forward.
Again, I sound repetitive, but I think that's so wonderful that you're able to do that. You're able to give that to your own children and now, make that a career, right? Where you're able to help children and families who are going through traumatic experiences and reframe and not take away from them the hardship that they're going through. And this is not about that, right? But it's about
Right.
offering another lens. And as you're speaking, I can't help but think about myself and just all my students who seem to enter this profession to heal ourselves, right? Like we come from trauma, and you came from trauma because having that illness is a traumatic experience, especially during that developmental time. Yet, yet, you were really able to persevere. And like for me, for instance, I wasn't able to persevere until later on, through a different later developmental phase and a complete work in progress my entire adult life. So you had this tool that you noticed served you really well, and now it's an ability to give to other people. Because I think I was also struck by you saying, you're always curious about people and how they think, feel, and act. I mean, that's me too, right? I think that's why we enter into you know, the helping professions in general, generally speaking. But again, mine comes from a trauma that was impactful in such what feels like a pathological way, while yours is coming from the other side. And it's just fascinating. So I guess based on that, I'm really curious, how do you define resilience in the context of child development?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so we want to, this is how I think about it, as parents, help our children to, yes, be able to move through and beyond the challenges that come up. But more than that, create the foundation for a resilient lifestyle, to really have the tools and strategies, the ways of showing up in the world that are going to help them to navigate challenge, but more than that, to accept the challenge is inevitable and it's going to happen, and to not get um, knocked down by challenge in a way that isn't going to allow them to get back up. So we want to help kids to do things like learn to manage their emotions and tolerate their frustration. So sort of manage their stress response in other words, through so many ways that we can help them do this. But one of the ways that I like to help kids, and I teach all the parents that I work with to do this as well, is to learn this technique called the relaxation response that was developed by a physician in Boston in the 1970s named Herbert Benson. And so what I teach is derived directly from his technique, coming up with a word or a phrase that you find soothing in some way, and breathing. 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening to kind of bookend the day. So you're really integrating what it feels like to be in this stress modulated space. And of course, there are developmental caveats, right? We can't do this with very, very young children.
Of course.
So what else can we do? We can take out the bubble wand and we can help them blow bubbles, take big belly breaths, just sort of integrating that idea for them, how they can modulate that stress response. And that really becomes integrated over time, helps them manage challenge. Other things, navigating friendship and social pressure, learning to focus on goals and breaking those goals down into small bite-sized pieces and appreciating the progress along the way when, small wins happen, that sort of thing. And then there are things like confidence and courage and instilling optimism. And so these are all ways that we can help our kids to build a foundation of resilience from a very early point.
Yeah, I think that that encapsulates what I was just thinking, this idea to build resilience at an early starting point. Because I think, generally speaking, when we think about resilience, we think about overcoming adversity, and that means like past tense or future, right? Like after the fact, and how can you recover from it? But you're, doing the intervention as it's occurring, right? As the challenge is occurring. And is there research that supports the idea that if you have these mediating factors or this ability to regulate during the crises or during the trauma or the challenge, whatever you want to call it, that actually um, creates a shift? And I don't know if that's a neurological basis or psychological, or how do you see that?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a really great question. And so definitely modulating through the challenge. But even more than that, we're sort of creating this foundation of resilience before perhaps the challenge even comes up
Hmm.
to make it easier to kind of ride those challenges like a wave, such that we're not, and our kids aren't starting up here,
Hmm.
and then a challenge or a trauma hits, and boom, escalation to the point of shutdown makes it really hard, makes people get stuck, but to make a long story short, there is research, I can't cite any specific studies at this particular moment, but definitely research that speaks to the fact that when our central nervous systems are modulated and we're showing up in that level space, definitely easier to contend with challenge as it comes up, but also a really important foundational piece of that resilient lifestyle and how that then impacts our ability to meet a challenge as it comes up. So we're definitely doing this ahead of time, not in the past tense piece of, and we also want to look at resilience much more broadly than just needing it when a challenge hits, I guess is the other point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, as you're speaking, it just makes so much sense. And I'm thinking about my psychodynamic framework and foundation and the idea of, I'm starting from early childhood, how we need to have effective soothing, right, from caregivers in order for children to learn how to self-soothe and just emotionally regulate, and how all of that works, right, as a part of development, and what goes wrong when one isn't attuned to. And there's breaks in that connection and that ability to emotionally hold, in addition to the physical holding of an infant, for instance. So um, that's why I think it's so important to be eclectic as a practitioner, right? To think about
Right.
all of these different ways of being and addressing challenges that people have. And I love this idea of like early intervention. And when we think again of early intervention, we think of young childhood, but early intervention, even within adolescence, right? We can reframe that to think about how somebody who is 17 or 20 and can utilize these tools to develop coping mechanisms so that when, as you're saying, things do arise, it doesn't feel like a crisis, or there's a way to manage one's internal state so that it doesn't lead to such adversity. Is that framing
100%.
it? Okay.
Yeah, 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 100%. And with the older kids, not even the older kids, but the not toddlers or infants,
Hmm.
really we want to be also another really important piece of building resilience alongside of our kids like this is connecting with them on an authentic human level. And to have that solid connection, super important.
Hmm.
And helping them to understand that it's okay to not succeed the first time out of the gate.
Hmm.
That's going to happen. It's inevitable. And helping them then to get back up and move forward from a different angle. And part of that is us as parents or having a trusted support person out there somewhere not be afraid to share their own struggles, their own challenges with the kids as a way of giving them a lens to look through, like, okay, well, so my mom or dad or, person that I know out there who's a support to me had challenges, maybe failed, but was able to get back up and move forward. And that's very, very powerful because sometimes, kids see their parents as these, people who have never had challenges, never had failures, and that's not helpful, And so kids need to have that in the foundation as well to see the potential for themselves to move beyond.
Right, but you're talking about, I mean, we're talking about the same things, but you just use different language. Where you're talking about modeling, and how important it is for parents to see, for kids to even see that their parents have limitations. Like I've spent my life trying to rectify that idea, that the parents have limitations, and parents do the best that they can. It might not be perfect, but it is the best that they can do, and
Yes.
that we're all, struggling in some way. So for you to kind of normalize that or have that approach that you're normalizing that and doing that for the child must be so relieving, not only to feel validated in their challenges, but also to know that it can get better, right? Because they look up to their parents as a model of somebody who has overcome to an extent, right? So important. So, that's it's interesting that you say also, because I'm thinking about expectations, and I've been thinking a lot lately about how many adults struggle with expectations from partners, from friends, from their children, right? And my lens is that it's most likely internalized from parental pressures when we are growing up. And you raise the idea of allowing kids to be ordinary, whatever that looks like for them.
Mm.
Does that mean removing pressures and expectations?
No, not really, because we want kids to have what it really means is to help kids to thrive within their own unique context, whatever that looks like for them. So it means really modulating your expectations, and sort of not putting pressure on your kid to, you know, be a football player when they really want to be a musician, that sort of a thing. And if the football thing doesn't work out, but they want to gravitate towards music, you know, being okay with that, being fully okay with that, and letting kids kind of discover and understand their own passions, their own interests, and then helping them to see and identify their own strengths within their context so that they can foster whatever they feel makes most sense to them. Also, at the same time, want to give our kids the message that really important to do your best. You might not always win, and that's okay as long as you've given your best. If you've showed up fully, given your best in that moment, that's all we can ask of you. And I think that's a really important piece because I do work with a lot of sports parents who get a little worked up
Right,
when, you know, the goalie lets a couple goals go
right.
through and, who knows what was going
And
on
they're
there. So
screaming on the soccer field.
I, I,
Right,
I work a lot with helping folks to modulate their stress response on the sidelines,
right,
because that's really really important for the kids, and just joining with the kids and giving space after a game or after whatever it is performance. Maybe the child thinks they didn't do as well as they wanted to, and leaving space for them to lead the conversation as opposed to us as parents jumping in and being like, well, yeah, that didn't go very well, maybe you should have done this or that, or
right.
all those things. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but
No, it's
those are my
very
thoughts.
helpful. The example helps, right, to bring the picture to life. But it makes me think like, oh, easier said than done. So how do we do this? Because it all sounds great.
I know,
I
I
help them
know.
do this and this, and how to be better, really better. Better parents. In my field, it takes a hell of a long time.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Easier said than done for sure.
Hmm.
All of this, right? And it's a process and has to start with small steps. And the modulation of the stress response is really important. The connection, building the connection is really important. However that looks, within your family construct, maybe it's family dinner, maybe it's time in the car, maybe it's, you know, catching a few minutes in the morning over a cup of coffee just to connect with your child in some way. It doesn't have to be for extended periods of time. We want them to have their autonomy and all of that. But that authentic human connection is so important, and kind of building from there and giving your child the idea that you're there to hear their experiences, hear how they're feeling without jumping in there to fix or change. And that's sort of a foundation to start from, and then
Right.
building from there. And then also some of the things that are important, helping our kids and ourselves to not only focus on the things that are going wrong and the challenges, but to at the end of each day, kind of maybe jot down 3 to 5 things that did go well on that day to kind of shift that lens to neutral so that we're not stuck over here. And I
Right.
do that with a lot of families, and it's really powerful because it really creates a new lens that they're looking through, and it really fosters a sense of gratitude and the ability to be optimistic despite all of the, numerous
Right.
inputs and chaos and hard things that are going on out there.
Right. So I'm wondering if you're doing long-term work, but let me just frame that in a larger question. I guess I'm thinking about how, again, this idea of easier said than done, because I like to push on this
Hmm.
because I can't tell you like personally, right, how many times I know what I need to do differently, right? But doing it is a whole nother thing. But you're giving, I think I'm hearing within there, concrete tools, right? Like try this. So I'm assuming you're making suggestions on how to not process this, not process their feelings around doing it, but really just here's something you can try. Here's something you can do. And then maybe coming back and talking about were you able to or what happened. But let me ask you, what does that process look like?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And so it begins with helping folks, usually it starts with the parents, self-awareness. What do they need to be optimized within their own unique context? What are the things that they need? And so moving from there, and yes, giving tools, suggestions within that context, things that might fit co-constructed, helping them to model and integrate some of these tools and strategies with their kids. So that's basically sort of where it starts, and
Hmm.
we build from there. And also, really important in that is knowing what their kids need to be optimized within their own unique context, because all of our kids are different, right? And sometimes we have this idea like, oh, well, what works for me is going to work for them. Not true, right? And two kids in the same house, same thing, very different kids, right? I've got twins, they're very different kids, have needed very different things to thrive within their own context. And so it's a process,
Yeah.
and there's no one size fits all, I guess, is important to mention. And just really being aware and doing the best you can to take those steps forward, and recognizing when small successes have happened, when there have been those small wins. And oftentimes we're moving so fast through our lives that we forget to notice, we forget to stop and look at those things. And so that's really, really important also. But yes, it's that process starts from kind of that self-awareness place. And then, yeah, we'll revisit. I don't tend to do long-term
Hmm.
work necessarily,
Hmm.
but really I work for as long as somebody needs to um, see results, feel successful in what they're doing, and to ultimately feel better, feel stronger within their context.
Isn't that all of our goal? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Feel better, right? Have a better quality of life. Um, it's interesting that you're saying about the need to recognize the individuality of your children. And I wonder how common that is, that people do recognize that. And I'm also thinking about something I say often is that every child in the same home has a different parent,
Mm.
right? Because you relate differently to each child based on your own expectations or your own unconscious transference of, who these kids remind you of or who you feel more aligned with or, all of these things. So I'm just curious in your experience, do you notice that folks recognize that they relate to their children differently?
Yeah, sometimes, sometimes not. And that if they maybe don't notice, that becomes part of the self-awareness discovery and sort of a piece of that context, like, oh, kind of what's going on with your kids and what's the interplay, interaction, and how, so it generally comes out there.
Hmm.
And then more of an understanding is built and developed. But some folks come in and they totally get it, and they know and they recognize that, oh yeah, this child needs this, and this is how I show up for them. And my
Right.
other child needs something different, and I
Right.
show up differently. So it
Kind of a
depends.
silly question now that I think about it because everybody's unique, right? So
Right.
there's not a, do you find this or that? Because my next question was going to be, do you find do you find that parents respond differently to suggestion or reflection based on the developmental age of their child, which is coming really from the place of, I wonder if having lived a longer time with a child and them being in a different developmental stage that proves challenging in different ways, like adolescence, for example, there's more receptivity to please, yes, I'm open to feedback because this is so challenging. But I'm sure it depends on the individual.
100% depends on the individual and depends on the kid, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes, a child is wired to be a little bit more difficult in early childhood or as a toddler, and then all of a sudden they click in and kind of come into their own, and adolescence isn't that difficult, but other times it can be flipped
Right.
on its head, and
Right.
so we never know.
Right. That kind of answered my own question as I was asking it. Like, no, it depends, as most things do. I want to just go back to this idea of ordinary,
Mm.
allowing kids to be ordinary, because word you used in your TEDx talk, I believe, that you didn't use here was helping them to be extraordinary or recognizing the ordinary as extraordinary. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because when we were talking about it today, it
Mhm.
sounds like ordinary is ordinary. Like we all go through things, and yes, but where's the extraordinary in there?
Yeah, so in the TED Talk, so I was talking a lot about my experience with hydrocephalus, and so those were extraordinary circumstances for a young child. Well, they would be this way today too, but particularly in the mid 70s when it was so treatment of hydrocephalus was in its infancy, really. And so, what I meant by that was those were extraordinary circumstances. And so, coming back to school, looking different, feeling different, and really all I wanted to do was be ordinary. Yes, within my own context, but
Yes.
also within the broader context of my peers in school and, experiencing the same types of things that they did. And there were a lot of moments where that wasn't possible. Either I was in the hospital or I was just recovering or I looked different a lot of the times. I had like half a head of shaved hair. I had these massive glasses.
Oh my goodness.
I had to wear this giant helmet while I ice skated with my class. We walked down to the skating rink in the winter once a week for gym, and the kids would laugh, and I had a core group of friends, fortunately, that were very supportive and obviously kind. They're still friends today. They were part of my tennis crew, but it was that's what I meant by the extraordinary. Like that was kind of outside of the realm of typical in those days or wherever in my experience. And I wanted to just be ordinary. I wanted to, for lack of a better way of saying it, I wanted to be like everybody else, even though we're never like everybody else. And
Mhm.
now I would argue, the comparison piece, we want to shut that down. And we want to really thrive within our own unique context. But that's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
It's kind of that
Well,
fitting in piece.
well, now hearing a little bit more about that experience and the trauma pieces of that, right? The impact on self-esteem and self-perception and identity, it sounds quite painful. And so the mediating factor of the way that your parents and your teachers emotionally held you and were attuned to you, um, you can see how that would contribute to a sense of resilience, and start to formulate a new perspective of you and your value and your extraordinariness within your ordinariness because you weren't ordinary, you know? So, yeah, of course, it's a compelling feeling to want to feel like you fit in. And so you were recognized, that recognition and sense of value, I assume, that was given to you by these meaningful figures in your life, excuse me, by these meaningful figures in your life, so important to your own development. But I think what's important for us to hear is that there was real struggle there. There was
Yes,
real struggle there.
there was.
Yeah. And so, look at you now, kind of thing, right? Like I sometimes step outside of myself a lot. This has been happening a lot lately. I don't know if this is an age thing where it's like, wow, from where I've come. I don't know if you have those moments, but to sit concretely and think about what were those factors that contributed to my resiliency. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it was much later in life. And it sounds like you had corrective emotional experiences early on that were able to help, as you say, mitigate the intensity of the experience that you had. Does that
I think
sum that
that's
up?
spot on. Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
spot on. And the corrective emotional experiences, they weren't always, obvious, right? I mean, because it's true. You mentioned, I mean, there was real struggle involved here, and it was not always easy. But I think I had this sense of it's going to be okay. You know, put one foot in front of the other. It's going to be okay.
Hmm.
And I think that was just sort of this underlying thread, this underlying message that I was extremely fortunate to have kind of
Hmm.
embedded within my life and experience early
Hmm.
on.
So how are your parents fed? Do you know? Because they fed you, right? Emotionally. And basically your whole premise, it sounds to me, is like you got to feed the parent in order to feed the child.
Right. Yeah, so they so they had a very strong community themselves, lots of friends, lots of, some friends who were physicians who would help kind of contextualize that sort of thing. So they had that going on. I think they were also very supportive of each other, kind of took on various roles within the context of what was going on. And they were each, and particularly this became obvious over time, supportive of me in different ways. They both were extremely supportive and kind of fostered this message of resilience and it's going to be okay, but in very different ways. And I think you know, it wasn't always easy for them either, obviously. And I think my mother to this day still struggles with some anxiety as a result of all of what happened or what went on.
I have to ask, since my expertise is in sibling relationships, do you have siblings?
I have a brother. Yep. I have a brother, and he's a bit older than I am, and we have a solid relationship. He went to boarding school when I was 11. So he wasn't around for a lot of what was going on. Um, but he and I, yeah, we have a solid relationship. I think that those early years we didn't hang out much, but you know, I think my mother though does feel somewhat guilty. He's doing great. I mean, he's extremely successful. He's married, he's got a lot going on. But I think my mother does feel guilty that a lot of the attention early on had
Mm-hmm.
to go to caring for my medical situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I guess I wonder, I mean, we don't have to get into that, and I appreciate your response, but I'm curious about his resilience, right? And what contributed to him having a sister who had a medical condition that was so impactful, and I'm sure on the family system, as you say. But that's a whole other discussion. Let me ask you this. What do you say to parents who feel like they're failing when their child struggles?
Yeah, so a couple things. Really trying to, once I get to know the parent situation, reinforce for them that they're doing the best they can. And you're not going to be able to control all of the variables. So, doing the best they can, kind of figuring out what, shifts might be useful, and then really helping them to hold on to the possibility on the other side of the challenges that their kids are having, is really, really important. And also helping them to helping reinforce with them the strengths that their children are bringing despite the challenges and the struggle.
Hmm. Great point. So if a parent were to start with just one change this week, and that's kind of so unfair because I know that we can't like tie this stuff up in a neat little bow, but what would you recommend?
So I would recommend either starting to integrate the relaxation response, which is coming up with that word or that phrase and breathing. I love folks to do it 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening to bookend the day to start to integrate,
I'm
or
gonna
you could
try
do it
that. Yeah, no,
for
it
two
sounds
minutes at
great.
a time, here and there. And the second thing would be to jot down 3 to 5 things at the end of the day that went well during the day. And that's really simple but really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. because we are certainly geared towards focusing on what went wrong, right?
Right.
It's so important. Um, do you have a hopeful message you want parents to take away about resilience?
I think it goes back to the possibility piece on the other side of challenge. And there's always possibility out there to move towards. And it might take time, but if you focus in on those small successes along the way, there is possibility out there.
Yeah, and you're here to tell the story.
Mhm.
Is there anything else that you think that the listenership would benefit from that we haven't covered?
I feel like we've really covered things very comprehensively and really well.
Okay, well, thanks for your messaging. I mean, it is hopeful, it's positive. I love the idea about possibility. Again, that's at the core of the strengths perspective, too. And I think that many of us could benefit from looking through that lens rather than the should, what we should have done, how we should be, how we should move through this world. And maybe this is part of it, too. This is what we should do in a much more hopeful framing. So, Dr. Kate Lund, thank you so much for being here. Just want to say again that your book came out in October. Everyone should check it out on Amazon or in bookstores. It's called Step Away: The Keys to Resilient Parenting. And you can learn more about Kate at www.katelundspeaks.com. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review on your podcast platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my next episode. If you're struggling with clients, I'm happy to consult or provide supervision. Consultations are also available for any person listening. If you're struggling with sibling abuse, you may want to join my sibling abuse workshops. I'm open to feedback on topics you'd like to hear or questions, so feel free to email me at drmeyerspod@gmail.com. You may be interested as well in checking out my blogs on my website at amymyersphd.org.
I've got some problems, yeah, I've got some questions. I need some help, point me in any direction. Clinical guidance is what I need to help me become who I'm meant to be. I've been searching for a teacher, another point of view. And I've been asking myself, what would Dr. Meyers do?